Hi, Courtney. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Me too. Courtney, I truly appreciate your time and willingness to share your experience with us today. So I'd like you to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, well, my name is Courtney. I live in San Francisco. I work here as a healer. I have for about 20 years. I was raised by a single dad. My mom died when I was 1, so it was just him and me. And he died last year from pancreatic cancer, which was really difficult. And even with all of my training as sort of a caregiver and healer, it was a really steep learning curve those last few weeks with him.
Sure. So I guess we can start with maybe, I think you briefly mentioned when we had initially talked your father's diagnosis and the prognosis. What were your initial thoughts and emotions when you learned about them? And can you share a little bit about his diagnosis and the initial stages of his illness?
Yeah. And, it was so interesting. My dad was just a health nut his whole life. He ate a very clean diet. I became a vegetarian when I was 10, and he became a vegetarian shortly thereafter. He ran 3 times a week until he had a hip replacement in his late 70s, and then he bicycled 3 times a week. Like, he was so into health. My mom died from breast cancer in 1986, and I think he was always health conscious, but watching his wife die this awful cancer death, he really doubled down on being healthy. And so his initial diagnosis was perplexing, more than devastating. It was like, no, I did everything right. My family lives a long time. I don't understand. I don't do all the things that all those idiots who get sick do. My dad was, I think, on the autistic spectrum. He could be really harsh, and he was very into being thin and into like having this sort of ascetic lifestyle. So it was very perplexing to him when he was diagnosed. He was diagnosed in, he died in 23. He was diagnosed in 21 with pancreatic cancer. And it was following a period where he wasn't feeling good. He had a lot of low back pain. And then one day he woke up and he was really jaundiced. His eyes were yellow. His skin was yellow. And he went to his doctor, who ran a bunch of tests and figured out he had pancreatic cancer. He was one of, apparently only 5% of the population is eligible for a Whipple procedure, which is a surgery where they take out the pancreatic tumor and anything it's touching. So, parts of the liver, the gallbladder, maybe the stomach, small intestines. And so he really weighed whether he wanted to do that surgery. He ended up doing it, and it was successful. They removed the cancer. But his physician recommended chemotherapy following that surgery. And after watching my mom go through really horrendous breast cancer chemo in the 80s, we've come a long way from what I understand. But he was adamant he was not going to do chemo. No way, no how. He wouldn't even talk to the doctor. I was like, Dad, just go see what the option is. Maybe it's like a one-time pill. Maybe it's much gentler than whatever you're imagining. But he would not even have the conversation. I am not doing chemotherapy. So his surgeon had told him he thought he had bought my dad another 5 years with the surgery. Surgeon was very happy with the procedure, but, that was really counting on the chemo. That was the follow-up to sort of get any stray cancer cells that were in my dad's body. So 2 years later, actually on my dad's birthday, May 23rd, I got a call from his doctor saying, I have been trying so hard to reach your dad. I really need to talk to him immediately. Can you please help me connect with him? And, my dad, I think even more so than a lot of the elderly generation, really hated telephones. And so he would only turn his cell phone on when he was expecting a call or had to make a call. So he was really hard to reach. We had to talk at these sort of like prescripted times every week. And if I missed him, I had to wait for the next week. So I knew it was hard to get away from. I don't know if he was avoiding that phone call also. He wasn't necessarily symptomatic. I had seen him a few months before the diagnosis. He was so thin and he really didn't have much of an appetite. And that frustrated him. He liked eating, even though he ate really small amounts. And he would just get full so quickly, and it sort of perplexed him. And yeah, I just remember his thighs were so thin. I remember thinking, wow, that really doesn't look good. So it wasn't totally a surprise when he was re-diagnosed at the end of May. I went up to Oregon to receive that diagnosis with him on the phone. And the physician said, I said, can you give us some kind of prognosis here? Is this weeks, months, years? And he said, probably months. We're talking months. And so we started the process of signing on to hospice at that point. I'm so glad we did, because he only lived another 6 weeks. It was very, very rapid this time around. And there were a couple different hospice options that we considered. It was really important to my dad to die at home. That was a lifelong goal of his. He did not want to be in a hospital. And so one of the hospices really emphasized home care as opposed to hospice care in a hospital. And we chose that hospice for that reason. And they were helpful connecting us with some resources we might have used if he would have lived longer, some sort of in-home care, people to do laundry and buy groceries and just come in a couple times a week and make sure he's okay. All of these services were more expensive than we anticipated and harder to coordinate with than we anticipated. And so we sort of dragged our heels on that, which ended up being okay because he didn't live long enough to really warrant that kind of care. But I was grateful for hospice for sort of knowing where to send us and starting some of those conversations. I'm trying to find the concise way to tell this story. I was planning to spend the summer in Costa Rica. And so after his diagnosis, I left and I said, Dad, we've got months. I'm going to come back in July and be with you again and see what the next steps are. And I'll coordinate your hospice care remotely until then. And the moment I landed in Costa Rica, June 10th, I got this strong intuition I had to go to Oregon. And I'm very spiritual. I feel very connected to my mom's spirit. I feel like she was just tapping on my shoulder for an entire week saying, you have to go to Oregon now. And I was like, Mom, I'm going in like a month, like chill. And she was like, no, you have to go now. And so I did. I booked a flight up to Oregon on Father's Day, which is my birthday also. And I spent a week with him. And I'm so glad I did. That was like the last real week I had with him. Because again, this proceeded so rapidly. The next time I'd see him, he was basically nonverbal and unconscious. So I'm so grateful for this last week I had. I also have to just mention, my dad and I had a really complex relationship. And I've seen folks whose parents died sort of rewrite the narrative in a way that they could have had a better relationship with their dead parent if they, the person I'm speaking of, would have done things differently. And I've witnessed this time and time again. Parent-child relationships are complicated. And I've seen people really beat themselves up over this idea of, I could have made that relationship better. I'm grateful for this week I had with him because it reminded me how complex our relationship was. He wasn't easy. He had a bad temper. He was not cooperative. He was very selfish. That whole week, he was basically just like giving me orders and not in any way cooperating with what the doctors recommended. Like he was still going up and down the stairs several times a day. He was still trying to drive. He was not making any sort of plans for when he couldn't do that. In his mind, he was stubborn, but also I think no one wants to think about the fact that I might be dying in the next few months. And so he did not consider, what am I going to do about going up and down those stairs? What am I going to do when I need to feed myself and there's no one here? He did let me buy him a little mini fridge, which I put next to his bed. His bedroom was upstairs. So I put that in for him. But we spent that week together and then I went back to Costa Rica. And again, I said, mid-July, I'll be back. Let me know if you need anything. At that point, hospice was not making regular visits, but they came out just to sort of assess the house and give us some advice on what to do that way. On July 3rd, I got a call from hospice that said, if you want to see your father again, you need to come on the next plane. Like, we don't think you might not even get to see him again. Like, by all means, get on the plane and do your best, but this is proceeding very, very rapidly. And I had talked to my dad a week previously, and I heard it in his voice. I heard that something had shifted. He was very ill. There was some, I don't know, fatigue or resignation or exhaustion in his voice that told me, oh, we're in a different phase of this disease now. We have progressed to a new chapter. So I did get on the next plane out of Costa Rica. I flew home on July 4th. I got a speeding ticket. because I was so distraught trying to find my Airbnb and get settled with him. And the next 9 days that I spent with him were so difficult and unexpected, and I felt really unsupported, which was hard. Hospice kept saying, he's going to go any moment. That was the message, like, you're lucky you got here to say goodbye, but like, it's going to be hours or days now. And I got there on like a Monday or Tuesday, I think. And every day it was basically like, oh, you're still here. Every time someone came over, they were surprised to see me. They were surprised they were making another visit, which is really hard because, again, it lasted 9 days. On Friday, they said, we'll be surprised if we see you on Monday. And I had to call them on Saturday and say, I need you to get someone out here. They don't often make weekend visits, apparently. But I said, we are in like late stages of dying, and I don't know what to do. I really need a nurse to come out here. One of the things my dad did in those late stages is, and apparently this is common, he kept trying to get out of bed. And he said it was because he needed to go to the bathroom. He needed to evacuate his bowels. He had already had, I'm sure you deal with this topic. He'd already had sort of like the big blowout that often happens near the end of someone's life. And we had to clean that up. He had not eaten. There was no way he had to evacuate his bowels, right? And so I was so confused, and he's not lucid. He's so weak, and he hasn't eaten in days and days. And he manages somehow to like get his legs out of the bed and start to push himself up. And, I am not equipped to deal with this. We don't have a hospital bed in the house. He's sleeping in a king bed. We don't have handicap friendly things in the home for him to get from point A to point B. So the hospice nurse who showed up was so helpful. And she said, often in these late stages, people know they have to go somewhere. They know they have to die. Their spirit knows it has to leave. But their mind interprets this as, I have to go. Okay, I have to go to the bathroom. I will get up and go to the bathroom. And so she checked, she did some exams on him. He was like, no, he does not need to use the bathroom. And it's really not safe for him to keep trying to get out of bed this way. Like, he's going to fall. He's going to hurt one of us, because it was so difficult to get him back into bed once he had halfway gotten out. And at that point, he was in so much pain. Every time we moved him, he just howled in pain. It was so hard for me, I think, especially just to see him suffering. And so at that point, that hospice nurse made a very strong recommendation, which I took, which was to keep him on a very strict timed regimen of painkillers. And we had, at that point, the cocktail he was taking was Ativan to help with anxiety and morphine to help with the pain. I think I had transitioned him from hydrocodones to help with the pain. So at this point, he's just on Ativan and morphine. And he didn't want to take it. Again, my dad was a terrible patient and very stubborn. And so this hospice nurse was like, look, she showed me how to like crush the pills, mix them with a little juice or maple syrup, mix it with the morphine, which was a liquid, and put that into his mouth and kind of put it between his teeth and his gums and let it just absorb there, which he didn't like. He sort of fought me at first. And again, this was why she was like, no, you just need to stay ahead of it so that he can't fight you. You need to like basically sedate your dad so that he doesn't hurt himself and doesn't fight us, and he can just let his body die. And I followed her advice. I understand why she gave that advice. I don't think it was bad advice. I also, for me, I knew he didn't want that. And I have a good friend who's a nurse, a friend's mom, actually. So, she's like in her 70s. She's been nursing her whole life. She's done plenty of end-of-life care. And she said, the best thing you can do for your dad is give him the death that he wants. So if he wants to stay at home, figure out how to keep him at home. And if he wants to be stubborn, let him be stubborn. Like, just let him have the dignity of dying the way he wants to. Another hospice nurse I watched on TikTok said, people die the way they lived. That has always stuck with me, because my dad was stubborn and did things on his own schedule and was not cooperative. And, that's how he died. He held on for those 9 days. I don't know what he was clinging to, but he would not let go. And he kept trying to get out of bed. He kept he just wasn't a good patient. He was doing things his way. And so a part of me regrets sort of forcing the medication because that's not how he wanted to die. And what's really interesting to me, so it took him 9 days. On maybe the 7th day, I do psychic work myself. I work with a lot of psychics. I talked to a psychic I've worked with for many years. And she said, "What are you giving him? He doesn't like it." And I told her, and she said, "Stop the Ativan. It doesn't make him feel good. Makes him not know who he is. And your dad really needs to know who he is in order to let go." And so the next time, and, in those last 9 days, the level of communication is very confusing. And all the nurses told me, be careful what you say in the room because he can hear. We know from, I don't know how we know this, but hearing is like one of the last senses to go. And so even if he can't talk to you, he can't open his eyes, he's still perceiving the words that are being spoken around him. And the hospice nurses were so adamant, so cautious to have difficult conversations about him outside of the room he was in to give him a little space from that. I was not so cautious. And that's one of the regrets I have also. I remember having conversations with family members or being on the phone with friends and saying things that in hindsight, I would have not said around my dying dad if I would have been a little more cognizant. But in this moment, I walked up to him and with just the morphine, no Ativan. And I said, "Okay, Dad, we're going to try something different. This is just morphine. There's no Ativan in it." And every time I would try to give him his medicine, he would sort of lock his jaw like he really didn't want it. He made it so clear he didn't want it. And I was so clear I did not want to watch my father howling in pain. And so I kept on with it. But I explained that to him and he relaxed his jaw a little bit and he let me put it in. And I was like, okay, I think we made some headway. The Ativan was to keep him from being anxious and restless. And he was tossing and turning a lot before that. And so without the Ativan, again, he started getting agitated. So the next time I came up to him, I said, "Okay, Dad, this time it's morphine and just a half an Ativan, just a little bit." And he locked his jaw again. And it was such a clear message. And this time I said, "I hear you. You don't want this. I'm not going to force this on you. Let me go get just some straight morphine." And that's what we did for the next, 48 hours, the last 48 hours of his life. The other thing the psychic told me, which I thought was, well, two things she told me that I feel like are important for passing on. One is she said, it'd be really nice if you could do something like read to him in these last days you have together. And that is one of my favorite memories of spending his death with him is we both loved A Prairie Home Companion. And so he had a book by Garrison Keillor on his bookshelf. And I just read him some anecdotes for that, which if you know any of that content, it's got a certain nostalgia and like real humanness to it that I think was very appropriate for this moment also. And that was really beautiful. And then she said, "You're telling him something that people aren't telling you to say that's really not registering." And in the death and dying world, people often tell children to tell their parents, "I'm okay. I'm okay. You can go. You don't have to hang on for me. I've got this. I love you. You'll always be with me, but you can go." And so I was saying that to my dad a few times a day because he was holding on. What can I tell this man to help him let go? It's time, right? This disease is not reversing. His body was a skeleton. It is awful to see what cancer does to a physical body, but it was so apparent. His body was done, but his spirit wasn't. His spirit was still hanging. So I would tell him this, and it just didn't land. I could tell. Those words were not getting in anywhere. And I've read so many hospice stories where those are the words that really let someone let go. That wasn't my dad. And again, we had a complicated relationship. I don't think he was hanging on for me. We barely spoke at that point of his life. And so this woman I was working with said, "Talk to him about your mom, who died when I was 1 and who he was in love with his entire life." He said, "Tell him your mom loves him. Your mom's waiting for him." And I did. And within, 12 hours, he passed. And of course, that was also the end of a 9-day struggle. His body couldn't hold on forever. But there was something really significant about giving him the presence of mind to, it's sort of like the dignity of again, presence. Like he needed to be with himself, to be in his right mind in some capacity, to choose to let go, combined with this message about his wife, who he had longed for all these years. And so I had to go back to San Francisco. I didn't know how long this was going to stretch out. And on a Thursday night, I flew out and my aunt and uncle took over caretaking. They do often say in hospice that people die when the room is empty, that sometimes people want to die alone. That really struck me. I had a soulmate cat who died a couple of years ago, and she clearly did not want to die around me. It was too complicated to share here, but like she found a way to die when I was not anywhere near her. And I think there might have been an aspect of that too. I said goodbye to him that night. I said, Dad, I'll come back on Monday if you're still here. But I think he wanted me to go. And I am so grateful I was not the one who found the body and had to call the undertaker and deal with all of that. My aunt and uncle did that. I'm so grateful to them. I could have handled it, but it was like, it was right. The way he left was right. And so, yeah, I think that's my story about my dad's ending.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I know I've experienced a lot of what you've shared, in my own practice, but also personally. I've seen my paternal grandfather, we did hospice at home, so with cancer. And so I saw that. My maternal grandfather, we did hospice in the hospital because it was like last end stage, last few days. And then we just had a very close friend who passed from brain cancer who did hospice in a hospice facility. And so I've had personal experience in three different stages, right? Or three different environments. And it's really interesting how different the experience can be, but at the same time, how similar the process can be. And absolutely kind of what you touched on at the end of there of like, they're seeking permission, right? And they want certain people in the room and they don't want certain other people in the room. And I experienced it firsthand with at least two of the three of those situations, just constant reassurance and constant like, hey, we're good, like it's time, right? And that's heartbreaking because you don't know how long that's going to be. You don't know if it's going, again, like you said, like sometimes they say it could be days to weeks and then it moves to hours to days. And then you're just waiting for that. Okay, when is it going to be minutes to hours? Right. And then it really, that minutes to hours phase is so long sometimes. And it's so hard on the person who's there because they just, it's exhausting emotionally for everybody who's just waiting for someone to die. Right. It's so hard.
And it's so hard to know how to show up for your person in that stage. Do they want you in the room? Do they want you reading to them and saying nice things? Do they want space? Do they want privacy? You have no idea. And so navigating that part where you feel like you just don't want to do anything wrong. You just want to show that person how much you love them in whatever way that takes shape.
It's so hard. And it, like you said, especially if they weren't willing to have those conversations early on because they're in denial and they don't want to talk about it, right? It's so much harder when you don't know what they would have wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. And, when my dad got his diagnosis, he was in Oregon. So he had the option of death with dignity, taking a suicide pill. And it was something he was interested in pursuing. But again, it just progressed so quickly. There was no time for actually exploring that option. But knowing that he was interested in that was also helpful for me, just to know that he ultimately understood he was dying and wanted to end that process as quickly as possible.
Excuse me. Yeah, that is, I guess that's good insight into knowing kind of what his stance on the whole situation probably was, right? How kind of going back to when you had to make that initial decision to enter hospice care, what were some of the key factors that influenced that decision?
My dad lived alone in rural Oregon and didn't really have friends or family. And so as much as I knew I would do my best to be a part of this process, I couldn't, move up to Oregon for months. And so I knew we needed help, and hospice is exactly the help that's designed for this situation. The hospital, his doctors were very helpful in recommending different facilities to consider, which I'm grateful for because I wouldn't even know where to start or what to assess. I was really nervous about payment. Is insurance going to cover this? It did, fortunately. And again, the hospital had a really great social worker who helped me navigate some of those questions. And then I think, we did interview both hospices, which means they both sent people out to meet us. And part of the decision was also, the first gentleman who came out was fine. He was great. But something about the second, my dad just really clicked. He really liked the doctor. I felt really comfortable with the nurse, like everything. We were like, okay, these people are the people we want on this journey with us.
Yeah, that's really important, right? Because like you mentioned, then they were coming in maybe infrequently at first and then very frequently, and they were meant to be your guiding light, right? And so you want to make sure that it's someone that you trust and are comfortable with. You mentioned they were coming in kind of, infrequently at first, and then we're starting to explore options that would have been nice for long term, which you didn't really end up needing. Can you describe the services and the support that they did provide, like that the hospice team provided?
Yeah, before he was in that acute stage, they were coming every 2 or 3 days, maybe, and mainly just checking vitals and making sure he had the supplies he needed, medical supplies, and just being a person to show up and talk to him. They don't do grocery shopping or meal preparation or laundry or cleaning, those sorts of things. When it ramped up, they were coming out every day. But the visits were still, very clinical. It was still very much about vitals and medical supplies. They would give him a sponge bath. I remember when I was there in June, it was really important to him that I washed his hair and helped him shave. I think maybe hospice continued with that too, some like sponge baths and shaving. And that meant so much to him. I think that's really worth noting, that there's something about maintaining your hygiene as best you can in these very compromised situations that really provide some of that dignity we're talking about. They would help with medication administration, but again, only when they were there, which was only once a day. And so they would give me instructions on how to maintain medication administration. And they were on call if something, dramatic happened, like when he tried to get out of bed. But they made it pretty clear that like this one daily 15-minute visit was sort of their scope. That's what they had to offer me. And anything outside of that was really my responsibility.
Yeah. And that's hard because you don't really know how to manage those 23 hours and 45 minutes, right? Like it's
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And his medical state is the same for those. He is, again, he was restless. He was confused. He was weak. He was in pain. He was sort of in and out of consciousness for part of that time. He did have, they talk about, you'll have like a rally day, a big surge of energy near the end. And he did have that day, which I'm glad people prepared me for, because it's very confusing to the care team, right? Oh my gosh, he wants to eat food and he wants to like read it. Like it's astounding. He went from, basically catatonic to having conversations with me. And kind of lost my train of thought with that. But when they're not there, he's just as ill as when they are there. And so it's sort of like I wanted that same level of medical care for him all 23 hours that they weren't there, like, can you check his vitals? Can you do some laundry? Can you change his diaper? Can you like do all these things that I think need to be done? Um, it's not necessary. And also, when you're not in a hospital, it just feels really overwhelming to have that medical care hanging over you.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I know you
Mm.
mentioned that, you and your father weren't as close towards the end of life, right? And you mentioned an aunt and an uncle who helped with some of that too. Was there any other family involved? And how did you and your family cope emotionally with the rapid decline of his health?
The only other family I have really on that side is my uncle, who I mentioned has three sons. Two of them live out of state, but my eldest cousin John came down for the day to say goodbye. Um, so that was really it. Uncle Tim, Aunt Barb, and me were the caretakers. Tim and Barb live on the coast, so they came by once or twice, but it was kind of a far drive for them. Um, I would say our family really doesn't do emotions. That's kind of our vibe. And so we didn't, we didn't really talk about how hard it was. We didn't really acknowledge how dramatic this experience was for all of us. Um, I could see it was really hard for Tim. He's my dad's brother. Uh, but that was expressed, people show grief in weird ways, especially if you're not very emotionally literate. And so Tim really didn't want to be around my dad. He wanted to hang out downstairs and support me by like bringing lunch. But he didn't want to see him. And I get it, and I think Barb was the one who found the body and sort of tended to things that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think, again, we don't really talk about emotions, my family. And so we just sort of, we are very practical people, I guess. And so they showed up with sandwiches and pie and helped me pack up some of his books that I was going to take to Goodwill. And it was much more about that than about sort of having an emotional moment around this, which was really hard for me. I'm very emotional. I'm very much my mom's side of the family. And so I had this incredible little crew of best friends. There were 3 of them on this text thread who I was just in touch with like every 10 minutes, like, you guys, what do I do now? You guys, this is really hard. You guys, I need a break. You guys, I'm thinking about making this decision. Should I do this? That was, fundamental, critical, irreplaceable. Like, that was the most important thing for me, even though they weren't local, just to have these people who I could, again, so many decisions are made in those last days. They all feel so important, even though I don't know if they really are, but that you just have this sort of I had this decision paralysis, and I just didn't want to make the wrong choice. And so it was really nice to have people to talk to about all of this. And also, it's just a lot to hold that, to witness a body basically decomposing in front of your eyes. It's very intense and sad. More than sad, though, I think there was enough adrenaline and cortisol running through my body. I didn't really feel sadness in the moment. It was like, I have to handle this. I have to figure out how to, make the right decisions, give him his medicine. I was already thinking about sort of like, oh my gosh. And then when he dies, what happens? Like, what happens with the estate, with attorneys, with the body, with the memorial? Like, I was definitely in go mode. And so I didn't really have time to feel sad or any feelings that way. But it was nice to have people who could at least reflect back the word that comes to mind is the horror. There might be a better word, but like the horror of watching someone die. It was really great to share that experience, not have to carry all that myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Having a good support system, even if available over the phone, is imperative, I think, during that time, because like you said, it really is.
Yeah.
It's traumatizing, right? But you don't.
It is. It really is.
Yeah. And you, as the primary, don't have the time to process or grieve.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
there's so many items to check off, right? There's so many
That's
missing
it.
parts to fill. And there's and at the same time, you're constantly checking to see if the person's still alive. Right.
That's it. That encapsulates it. And it sounds so cold to me when I relay that to people initially, but I guess that's just the way it goes, because what you just said is exactly my experience.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's strange. Again, my dad and I had a complicated relationship. I don't feel a lot of grief that he's not on this planet anymore. And some of that is related to my own spiritual beliefs. I really believe his soul continues and I can talk to him when I need to. But that death was traumatic. It really was traumatizing. And if I had to grieve and sort of like, do therapy over anything, it was being with him when he died, and sort of like whatever is arising in those days, those moments really gets compartmentalized and pushed off to the side. And your brain says, no, I'm going to help you put one foot in front of the other right now,
Yeah.
which is what we need. That's why the shock response exists.
Right.
But it was a lot for me to unpack that trauma in the months following his death. That was the biggest thing for me.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's that moment that's so traumatizing, just waiting for somebody to die. There's often a lot of misconceptions when it comes to hospice care, right? Hospice care can be beautiful in what it is meant to be, right? But it comes with a lot of challenges, and it can be very traumatic, like you just explained. And so I hear often a lot of misconceptions about hospice care and its role in end of life. Did you have any before you entered, or did you encounter any as you were going through the process?
Yeah, I absolutely did. I think for some reason, I just thought hospice was going to be more present with us. I thought hospice meant someone was going to sit at his bedside for an hour or two every day. I thought, I just expected like more from them, more touch points, more presence, more like active managing of the situation. And that's really not what they're there for. They're not there to actively manage the situation. They are a support structure. They provide a lot of information and knowledge, and that's useful. They provide medications. That's very useful. But my dad had a hip replacement a few years ago. And in the aftermath, we had some in-home care where a nurse would come and check on him and make sure he was doing his PT exercises and help him with anything around the house as far as mobility. And basically that's what hospice was. It was an in-home nurse visit once a day just to make sure he had everything he needed. But it was none of the sort of like, I don't even want to say emotional support. Again, it was like that companionship piece. For some reason, I hear hospice and I just think there's this like caretaking aspect of it. And the caretaking really was medical, full stop. And so that was I don't know where I picked up that misconception, but I really did. And that was hard for me to understand. Once I started wrapping my head around that, I said, oh, I am really the caregiver here. They're not caregivers. They're like a little medical team who comes and checks on him. But I'm the caregiver.
Yeah. I want you to know that you're not alone in that misconception. I think a lot of times, and maybe it's pop culture, maybe it's the way hospice has been portrayed over centuries or decades on TV, in movies and shows, but the reality is that that's what it is at home. If you have hospice care at home, all it really is the medical management of it. Now, hospice in facilities, hospice in the hospital can vary a lot, right? Because that is very hands-on and they're also the caregivers. But hospice at home is absolutely beautiful and a great option for those who want to do it at home, right? Who want to die at home. But it comes with a lot of challenges that need to be addressed, right, early on. And how do you do that if you haven't had the conversations, right?
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that's the exact like juxtaposition that I didn't consider. I always thought of hospice as hospice in a facility. And then I think you do have more touch points. You have more people stopping by. Maybe people have the luxury of being able to sit with you for a while. But hospice and home, it's an outpatient service, it's an out call. And it is very different, I think. I mean, I've never experienced hospice in a facility, so I can't speak to that. But based on what you just said, I think that's a lot of where it kind of got twisted in my mind. It was like, okay, we're going to recreate a hospice facility in my dad's home.
Yeah,
Right.
which you
Yeah. And that's
can,
not
but then you
quite
have to
what happens.
hire private caregivers, and that is expensive, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
In those 7 weeks, are there any particular moments or memories that stand out to you as especially significant or meaningful? I know you mentioned the book reading. Anything else? Or you can share more about the book reading.
I mean, there were a lot. So I'm trying to, choose the ones that were most poignant. It feels like every minute of those 7 weeks had a weight to
Mm-hmm.
it. Every minute I knew it might be one of the last. And so I needed to pay more attention, and I needed to bring all of me to the table. I wanted to make sure he didn't die with anything left unsaid, with any regrets on my part. Just wanted to really, in some ways, there's a luxury of hospice that you don't get with like a sudden death, because you get to choose how you're saying goodbye. And so those 7 weeks was a very long, conscious goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, that week I spent with him in Oregon around Father's Day was full of moments like that. When he called me the week before I went back for the final visit, I always remember that call. Again, I could tell in his voice something was different, and it was so striking. And I don't know how I knew it, but I knew it listening to his voice. And I remember I had him on speakerphone, and my boyfriend was with me in the room. And my dad got a little choked up. And again, my dad was not an emotional man. Moors are not emotional people. And so he got a little choked up, and that made me really uncomfortable. And so I sort of glossed over his moment of getting choked up. And afterwards, my boyfriend was really right to say, like, I think that was your dad trying to say goodbye. That was the moment. He was acknowledging what was happening. It was like this sliver of not being in denial anymore and wanting to connect with you. And I do regret not being able to meet him there. I forgive myself for it, because I understand completely why I reacted the way I did. But I think about that moment, and I think, especially if you're dealing with someone with a lot of emotional walls and stubbornness and denial, those little slivers of meeting reality and wanting to meet people where they are just irreplaceable. It's just this magical moment where two people are really in the same place at the same time together. So I think about that a lot. And then, when I first got to Oregon in July, I went over first thing in the morning. I landed at nighttime, so I went over first thing in the morning, and a nurse was there helping him, the hospice, make their calls at like 9 a.m. And I bent down to say hi to my dad. And again, like when I'd seen him 2 or 3 weeks earlier, he was having full conversations with me. He was looking me in the eye. He was asking for food. He was laying on his side and just sort of woozy in and out of consciousness, not on any medications. And I said, "Hi, Dad, I'm here." And he opens his eyes and he says, "When do you think my daughter will get here?" And he'd obviously been asking hospice that. And I said, "Dad, it's me. It's me. I'm here." And he just smiled, and it was like his whole, everything relaxed. His face, his body, his spirit. It's like this moment of letting himself really be cared for. And that was a really special moment. And it was one of the last moments that he could talk to me. Even in that, he didn't recognize me at first. He wasn't totally there. But it was one of the last moments when I felt like he and I were connecting the way he and I connected. After that, it was this weird shell version of him that I was trying to connect with. But yeah, it was one of the last ones of connection. that funny rally that happens wasn't a moment of connection. It's so bizarre and it's so disorienting. Because he was just all business. He was like, where's my iPad? Who has moved the things from my bed? I would like a piece of watermelon right now. He was so demanding. And so again, demanding dad is not connected dad, but there was something about the real like vulnerability and relief of that moment where we locked eyes that was very, very, very meaningful to me.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Um,
So
yeah.
it's been a year, you said now, since he's passed. Yeah.
Yeah.
How have you been coping with that grief and the healing process? I know you mentioned compartmentalizing it and maybe healing yourself as a healer. But how's that been?
So not what I expected. My mom died when I was 1, before I remembered her. And so my grieving of my mother was very prolonged and indirect. I don't even think I understood I had a mother until I was like 7 years old. And it was really in my teenage years that I started really crying about it and missing her and recognizing this gap in my life. So, it was like a decade that I grieved for my mom, and I'm probably still grieving for her just because her absence is what defines her. And so I sort of expected another prolonged grieving with my dad. And I feel cold saying this, but it's my reality, it's my truth. I really haven't grieved for him not being here. I've had moments I miss him. I've had moments where I want to pick up the phone and realize he's not there, or I want to share something with him and I realize I can't. I just don't feel grief that he's not here. I have had to do a lot of grief, like I said, around the trauma of him dying. The friend's mom, who's a nurse, so I mentioned, sent me a great book. Cannot remember the title, but it's Anecdotes from a Hospice Nurse. And I just sobbed my way through that book. It was so helpful in helping me acknowledge what I'd been through, acknowledge I'm not alone in going through this, acknowledge the complexity of someone dying and the weight of someone dying, and just the not ideal conditions in which people die. I think my dad always talked about his whole life how the goal was to just not wake up one day, to go to bed and not wake up. And I know he was sort of attached to that idea that because he lived this healthy life and his mom died when she was in her 90s, that's what his life was going to be like. He was going to live this long, somewhat active life and then not wake up one day. And gosh, death and dying is just nothing like it looks in the movies or in your head or anything we conceive of.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the thing I had to really grieve, was that death is ugly and death is messy and death is not at all something you have any control over or any sense of structure with. It's messy. Death is really messy. So I really had to grieve the messiness of his death. That book helped a lot. Did a little therapy. I don't think I had a very good therapist. I might try again with another therapist at some point, but I don't know. That didn't really work for me. I think what I really needed to do was talk about those 9 days. And it was so emotional. It took me a long time, and it felt like something that it was so heavy in me. I didn't want to talk to my friends about it because it felt like then I'd just be sharing this heaviness with them. And most of my friends have not lost parents. And so I feel like I'm a little bit of a crusader that way. I don't have a lot of community who's walked this path yet. And so I don't know, I was really hesitant. I also just felt like, oh God, Courtney, you're still talking about this. And I know that's not how anyone sees it, but that's how I felt. It's like, oh, do I still want to talk about those awful days when my dad was dying? Isn't it time to move on from that? Can we talk about something lighter than that at dinner or breakfast or whatever else? So when I eventually could talk to someone about how hard those 9 days were and really feel that pain, that was a really important turning point for me.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, kind of a cliche, right? You have to feel your feelings to like let them move through you, but that's what it took.
You do. I mean, you can't process it without talking about it, right? Um,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
feel that sharing this story with others now helps with your healing process too?
I think so. I'm surprised how much I've been able to relate these stories and not get too emotional. I've had a couple moments where it really rose up, but yeah, it feels like it's becoming more of a part of my story instead of like a trauma that I'm recovering from. And yeah, I sense that grief is not linear and doesn't make sense. I sense that I'm entering this new phase of grief where I am wanting to reach for him more, which is interesting. And I don't necessarily feel like a grief when I realize I can't connect with him that way. But, we only saw each other once a year and we talked on the phone every week, once a week for 5 minutes. There's a way that it's like slowly creeping into my full consciousness that he's gone. And so I guess recognizing that aspect has been helpful. That, okay, that's what it's been like up until now, but it's not. I think all of us with grief, we want it to be this thing we do, and then there's this endpoint, and then we're
Right.
done. And now we can go back to living. And even though I know that's not true, talking about it has helped me realize, oh, I'm talking about my grief up to this point, and now it might morph, and now my grief is going to look like something different, something in some ways lighter, in some ways heavier, though. It's just going to change. And so here we go, continuing this path. I don't know if it ever ends, especially with a parent. I think that's a grief that rises up in different ways at different
Yeah.
times.
And I think it's important to distinguish the fact that a feeling of loss does not necessitate a feeling of grief, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
feel the loss of someone without having grief about it, right? And so there are so many moments in life where that loss can come up, right? Especially with a parent. I mean, when you see Father's Day, a birthday, an anniversary, or like holidays, right? Things come up where you're going to feel that loss, but that doesn't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
mean that you're feeling the grief too.
Yeah, that's really interesting and something I'm going to have to think about some more. That really hits
Yeah.
home for me.
What advice would you give to other family caregivers who might be facing a similar situation?
It's so interesting to consider a similar situation because it seems like everything is going to be so different for every family, every loss, every diagnosis, every person. Um, I really loved the advice Nurse Kathleen gave me. Help him have the death that he wants. And even if that's not the death that you would want for him, even if that might make things more inconvenient for part of the process, that's such a valuable gift to give someone and to allow someone to have the death that they want. So I would say really focus on that. What kind of death does your loved one want? And let that be more important than what you want or sort of like what's convenient for your family.
Yeah. I think that's a really good piece of advice. It's really important to really try our best in honoring their
Yeah,
wishes and
yeah,
honoring what they would have
exactly.
wanted, right?
And then, like you said, having a good support network is
So,
just so important. It changes the whole experience. And so I know families are complicated. If family is not that support network, even if, family is close, you might really gain a lot of insights or solace by reaching outside of your family unit to find some of that support and share your journey as you're going through it.
yeah, definitely. Now, as we're wrapping up, I like to leave the audience with a takeaway as best as possible, and I understand, I appreciate where you said every family is going to be different, every situation is going to be different. But what is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to maybe caring for a parent specifically while they're in hospice care?
I think it's really a gift that you are giving this person and that hospice is even this person. I think hospice is such a gift. I'm so grateful for the institution, even though it isn't what I expected, but just to have access to that sort of knowledge and just to like demarcate this transition out of this world as a special time and place. I remember I dated someone once who was an EMT, and he was with a lot of people when they died. And he thought this was such an honor. He said, some people get to be in the room when a person is born and we celebrate that. I get to be in the room when a person dies and I celebrate that. I thought that was so beautiful. And I think there's something to that in our hospice experiences also. We get to be a part of this sacred transition out of this world. And it is absolutely a gift. And the fact that you are making it a special time is something to celebrate. Again, it's such a different experience than, a death by a car crash or a heart attack or something where you don't have the process of dying. And so even though it's sad, celebrate this sacred transition. Find a way to really acknowledge the gift of this sacred transition for yourself and for them.
I think that's beautiful. Courtney, thank you so much for sharing your heart-wrenching lived experience as a
Thank you so much. It really meant a lot to talk here today.